Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Whip Union, and in this one we start out here in the direction of Robotyne, where following the recent Russian advances in the central parts of the village, the Russians are now also attacking in the eastern parts, moving up along the roads of the village, pushing towards the Ukrainian fortifications in the east of the village. The Russians here have an interest in pushing into and gaining control over these fortifications to secure the central hold of the village, both to the east and to the west of it, before moving on to the northern fortifications of the village. This will allow the Russians to gain full control of it and start moving in the direction of the northern fortifications to the north of the village. Getting control of that as well will allow the Russians to push through the forest lines and flank the Ukrainian positions by the fortifications northeast of Robotyne. Combining that with the Russian forces to the northwest of Verbove, they could flank the Ukrainian positions, which would completely seal off any Ukrainian positions south of this pocket, and the Russians would be able to negate all of the Ukrainian gains that they did for themselves throughout the summer offensive. In this section of the front line, the Ukrainians launched their summer offensive in the summer of 2023. In that operation, they managed to push south towards Robotyne, gain control of the village, and move to gain a foothold on Verbove across the Surovikin line. The Russians have since then managed to recapture the Surovikin line and push northwest of Verbove towards the main Ukrainian defensive line north of Robotyne, push the Ukrainians back west of Robotyne and to the south of the village to regain control of the fortifications and move into the central parts of the village. The Ukrainians have been able to withstand Russian advances for many months, allowing them to hold on to Robotyne until this point, but the Ukrainians' hold on Robotyne is weakening day by day, signaling the end of the Ukrainian hold of the village, as the Russians may soon gain full control of it, and the third battle of Robotyne would be over. Moving on to the next section of the front line, we see here northwest of Avdiivka, the Russians have advanced towards Novopokrovske, to the northeast and to the east of the village, advancing through the forest lines towards the Ukrainian positions. The next battle to the southeast would be by this area right here, before the Russians would move on to the south of the village, and in the northeast the Russians will likely move towards the village itself along the river line and by the forest lines towards Novopokrovske. The Ukrainians are defending the village using the 47th Mechanized Brigade, where we previously have seen both an Abrams tank and Bradley infantry fighting vehicle that the Russians have destroyed near the village, showing that the 47th Mechanized Brigade are present and are actively using their armored vehicles and tanks in the defense of the village. To the north by Sokil, similar situation has appeared, with Ukrainian Bradleys being used in the area, signaling that the 47th Mechanized Brigade are currently holding the line southwest of Robotyne after the Ukrainian 115th Mechanized Brigade withdrew from the area of Robotyne, Novopokrovske and Solovyovo following the Russian breakthrough. The main reason for that is reported that the Ukrainian fortifications in the area are hardly well prepared, meaning that the Russians were able to break through with little difficulty. We see that the Russians managed to gain control over the fortifications and trenches south of Robotyne within a matter of one single day to gain control over the southern parts of Robotyne, before the next days gaining full control over Robotyne, while the Ukrainian forces were unable to hold on to their positions. It was reported by the 115th Mechanized Brigade that the reason for their withdrawal from the village and the surrounding areas was that they were unprepared for a Russian advance. It was reported to them that the Ukrainians had several lines of defense ahead of Robotyne and their positions, but the Russians managed to break through fairly quickly, which they did not expect, and them not being properly organized and prepared for a Russian fight, we saw them withdraw from these areas to reorganize and secure their positions before actually holding their lines. This is why the 47th Mechanized Brigade was sent to clear and hold the gaps to prevent further Russian advances. North by Arkhangelsk and other villages, the Ukrainian forces had different units holding their positions. Them being abandoned ended up with them being left without armored vehicles to support them, which forced them to withdraw on foot, as we saw footage of, while they were under fire of Russian artillery. So we see that the Russian positions and advances here to the north of Avdiivka was largely due to a Ukrainian disorganization of the defensive positions, the miscommunication between the units, and the lack of cooperation between them. And all of that was caused by the Russians moving through and ignoring the Ukrainian positions by Berezhny and Semenivka to simply push through to Robotyne suddenly as a surprise attack while the Battle of Berezhny and Semenivka were ongoing. This shows that the Russians were able to have a large enough reserve in the direction of Avdiivka available to launch such an offensive operation and take an advantage of the Ukrainian disorganization to gain control of Robotyne, which was the main stronghold. We did not expect Robotyne to fall so quickly. It instead fell fairly quickly, and the Russians have since taken advantage of it by capturing tens of kilometers in the area. We see that the Russians are currently launching offensive operations all across the front line. Going through them one by one, we see that in the north by the Kharkiv region, the Russians have gained control over Kislivka and Kotlyarivka, where here with the control of these two villages, the Russians have significantly improved their positions here in the Kharkiv region and will likely use this as a springboard for further offensive operations towards Kupiansk. But this requires that the Russians dedicate troops and units to this section of the front line to launch such an operation. In the meantime, we see that forces of the Russian army are being prepared by Kolomiachivka in the direction of Selmahivka, where they are preparing an assault towards the village to gain control of it by the Serebets river line that goes through here from Selmahivka and all the way down south to Lyman. To the east of the Serebets river line, we see that fighting continues, which is largely positional, east of Yampolivka and Terny, where the Ukrainians have been counterattacking to regain positions, and the Russians are trying to hold on to their positions east of these villages. The Ukrainians here successfully managed to improve their positions and stabilize the front to prevent a Russian assault towards the villages themselves, and has increased the Ukrainian positions' safety in the area. Further south in the direction of Bakhmut, the main fighting is taking place west of the city towards Chasiv Yar, where we similarly had a Ukrainian brigade which refused to fight. This was reportedly the 67th Mechanized Brigade of the Ukrainian Armed Forces. After its withdrawal, it was disbanded and it was spread up into different units, where they are now fighting under different units. The Ukrainians have sent additional forces and are holding a large concentration of their forces in the direction of Chasiv Yar. It is reported by the analysts of the Ukraine war that a collapse of Chasiv Yar and Russian control of the city would mean a bigger disaster than the fall of Robotyne or Avdiivka. The Russians would be able to gain fire control over Konstantinivka, which is this major city here in the Donetsk region, similar to Kramatorsk and Solovyansk. If the Russians gain control over Chasiv Yar, they would be able to launch offensive operations towards Konstantinivka here from the east, and it would significantly improve the Russian positions here to the west of Bakhmut. The Russians are here attempting to improve their positions by attacking the micro-district of Chasiv Yar, the southern and northern flanks by the forest lines, where the Ukrainians have a significant force present and are dedicating a lot of their troops to hold the line, which they successfully have been doing for the past few months. We see that the Russians got a foothold in the micro-district, but were pushed out, and the Ukrainians have stabilized the front yet again. However, by the southern flank, the Russians have reached the canal crossing and heavy fighting is taking place there. We'll have to see if the Ukrainians will be able to hold their lines or if the Russians will be able to break through. A Russian breakthrough in the southern flank by the crossing would allow them to push into the main parts of Chasiv Yar and to expand their foothold across, which would allow them to start offensive operations towards the main part of the city and would weaken the Ukrainian positions in the micro-district and significantly improve the Russian positions there to storm the part of the city and gain control of it. So we see heavy fighting taking place by the micro-district itself and by the southern flank as the main parts. Moving further south in the direction of Avdiivka, we have to look at the front line from the highway to the east of the city and down south to Netailove, where everywhere the Russians are launching offensive operations, advancing bit by bit across the whole front, trying to improve their positions, move towards the villages of Novopokrovske, Kalinove, Sokil, Novopokrovske, Umanske, Robotyne, and Netailove, all in an attempt to gain control of all of these villages and move on to the next Ukrainian defensive line and improve the Russian positions here to move in the direction of Konstantinivka from the south and Pokrovsk from the east. South of the area here to the west of Donetsk, we have a front that spans from Netailove to the north and Vuhledar to the south. In this section of the front line, the main focus of the Russians is the pocket south of Pervomaiske, Krasnohorivka city itself, and here by Novopokrovske. The main objective of the Russians here is to gain control of Krasnohorivka. Gaining control of the city would significantly improve the Russian positions west of Donetsk and remove any Ukrainian positions here to the west of the city. The Ukrainians will not be able to hold on to Nevelske if the Russians capture Krasnohorivka, so this whole northern part of the front would be negated by the Russian capture of the city if the Russians manage to capture Krasnohorivka. Within the city of Krasnohorivka, we see that the Russians have recently captured the industrial zone of the city. This took place 3 days ago on the 4th of May. The control of the industrial zone has allowed the Russians to gain a significant presence within the city. It allowed the Russians to build up their forces, start offensive operations to gain control over the southern and western parts of the city, and start attacks towards the residential area in the north. The Ukrainians have one last line of defense, which is the high-rise buildings here to the north of the industrial zone and to the northeast of it. Both of these areas are significant Ukrainian defensive lines within the city and the final of its kind. Following that, the Ukrainians would have no significant presence throughout the whole city that they are able to hold on to, and it would be the beginning of the end of the battle of the city, where the Russians would end up in control of it after a continuous advance throughout it. As for the direction of Novopokrovske, the Russians are trying to launch offensive operations towards Pereskovivka, gain control of that, after which you'll move further towards the Dacha area of Konstantinivka, which is a smaller area separate from the city, where the Ukrainians usually have that as a vacation home area, while the Russians will also start moving towards the city itself from the east and from the south. It is likely that the Russians will improve their positions in the fields to the south of Konstantinivka and then move on to the city, similarly to what they did by Novopokrovske. This would be an attempt by the Russians to gain control over the road between Marinka towards Konstantinivka and be able to use that towards an assault towards Vuhledar, combining that with assaults from Pavlivka and Mikilske from the south and southeast. The Russians would be able to attack Vuhledar from multiple directions and cut off all supply lines to and from the village. And that is all about the front lines across that of the front line here between Russia and Ukraine. In the meantime, the inauguration of Vladimir Putin happened today. It was fairly uneventful. Nothing significant happened. The Ukrainians launched some sort of operations by Crimea and eastern Russia/Ukraine borderline, but there was no significant developments in that regard. So in the end, nothing significant happened. It was fairly uneventful, and the situation for now is stable, both politically and across the front line, as the Russians steadily try to push across the Ukrainian positions and fortifications, and they are currently holding the advantage, and the Ukrainians are trying to hold on to and stabilize their positions and prevent a collapse of the front line. And that will be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.